Let's break down the UN vote for you. It happened last night. 23 African countries voted in favour of the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's military action in Ukraine and demanding its unconditional troop withdrawal. This includes heavyweights Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana and Egypt. South Africa was among a group of 18 African countries that abstained, joining Mali, Uganda and Zimbabwe. Eritrea was the only country from the continent to vote against the adoption of the text. But an overwhelming majority of 141 countries ensured the draft's passage, a move immediately welcomed by the United Nations Secretary-General, who said it was his duty to stand by the text and be guided by its call.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favour, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution is adopted.
Russia's position increasingly isolated among the 193 member states, with just 4 countries, Belarus, Syria, the DPRK and Eritrea, siding with Moscow, despite this effort from its envoy.
We call on you not to support this draft. However, we know about the unprecedented pressure that our Western partners are exerting on a large number of countries, urging them to vote as they see fit. This document will not allow us to end military activities. On the contrary, it could embolden Kiev radicals and nationalists to continue to determine the policy of their country at any price.
Western countries hailed the vote as sending a clear message.
The world has spoken with a clear, united voice. Together, the vast majority of the world has condemned Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We have deplored Belarus for allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. We have affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The Secretary-General, finding himself at odds with Moscow over his fierce defence of the UN Charter, spoke after the vote.
The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. We don't have a moment to lose.
Mr. President, let me reiterate our position.
South Africa's abstention expected after its swift backtrack from an earlier position calling for Russia's immediate withdrawal from Ukraine, asserting the view that the draft was unbalanced.
The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue.
But a majority of African countries voted in favour.
Rwanda voted in favour of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations.
Human rights organisations have issued stinging rebukes of Pretoria's position. Human Rights Watch's UN Director Lou Charbonneau told SABC News that the abstention was an insult to Nelson Mandela's legacy. Quote, when a country like Russia disregards human rights and international humanitarian law by bombing civilians in Ukraine, South Africa should be condemning it loudly and clearly. This was echoed by the Executive Director of the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, Savita Pondi, who said that while she respects South Africa's position on creating an environment for dialogue and mediation, this was a time to stand unequivocally with the UN Charter and Ukraine. Sherman Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
All right, from New York, let's take you live now to Brussels. That's where we find our correspondent, Rosie Birchard. Rosie, thank you for being with us. How is the EU dealing with what has become a humanitarian crisis deeply affecting neighbouring countries? What's the latest?
Well, the United Nations says now that in just the 1 week since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, more than 1 million people have fled Ukraine into neighbouring countries, and many of them into EU countries. Remember, there are 4 European Union countries that share a border with Ukraine. So far, Poland has really received the most of those. EU Home Affairs ministers have been meeting in the building behind me to discuss how best to accommodate these people. And they have agreed politically to essentially relax some asylum rules to allow those fleeing Ukraine easier access to residence permit, to the job market in the EU and to education. They say once that's adopted, which should be within the next few days, those rights will be immediately offered to those fleeing Ukraine, particularly Ukrainians. This is how they're trying to kind of move forward with this. But that won't, of course, solve this acute situation at the borders. They're also looking for extra funding opportunities. We heard from the bloc's Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson. She said we need proper funding for this, so we know that is something they are also looking into to try and really stem what, as you said, is now a humanitarian crisis, as more than 1 million people have fled since the start of this war.
Wow, that's an incredible number just a week on. Remember, Ukraine is not part of the EU, so concessions are being made. It sounds like the EU is scrambling. There is debate that around whether or not the West has been consistent, isn't there? When you look at how Poland and Hungary in 2015, for example, refused to accommodate Syrian refugees compared to what is happening right now.
Yes, the EU has, over the past few years, been bitterly divided when it comes to issues of asylum and migration. Those countries which are now essentially throwing their borders open to Ukrainians from their neighbouring country have in the past shown reticence towards accommodating even small numbers of people fleeing conflict or refugees or migrants. The EU's top court has even accused those countries and ruled that they violated EU law by not accepting what the EU says were their fair share of refugees, particularly in what was then called a refugee crisis back in 2015. Now, we've heard from some rights organisations today. For example, Oxfam has essentially said the EU has a bad track record on migration and asylum. However, this looks like this could be a turning point. We see greater unity among EU member states, a greater willingness to show solidarity. And they said instead of looking back, perhaps it's the time really to look forward. So we have heard some commentary on this, some criticism, but overall this is an unprecedented unity among EU member states when it comes to these very thorny issues of migration and asylum for the bloc.
Yeah, I'm sure that will remain contentious. Rosie, lastly, the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva was expected to debate the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What came out of that, and put it into the context that there are calls that President Vladimir Putin be taken to the International Criminal Court at The Hague?
Absolutely. So that Human Rights Council urgent debate was proposed by Ukraine on Monday. It was voted on by the 47 members of the United Nations Human Rights Council. South Africa is not currently a member, but it is campaigning for membership. That vote passed and the debate took place today, is even taking place as we speak. We heard from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. She spoke about tens of millions of people in Ukraine essentially potentially being in mortal danger. We then, however, heard from the Russian ambassador. He said that the Ukrainian government is essentially a criminal regime, and he accused Western powers of trying to use President Zelensky as what he called a trump card in their confrontation with Russia. We then heard from the Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister. She gave quite an emotional account of life in Kiev. She talked about running to the basement to escape from bombs. She said, we are alive, but we are not safe. So while we have this war unfolding on the ground, we also have this war of words in Geneva. And meanwhile, we have heard from the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor that he has opened an investigation into allegations of war crimes in Ukraine, and that investigation is now underway.
All right, thank you for bringing us the latest. SABC correspondent live in Brussels, Rosie Birchard.
From Brussels back to the UN as we look at that vote further. You would have seen that story there by my colleague Sherwin Bryce-Peace, who was, of course, unpacking for us this particular vote. Let's take a look at what this vote means with International Analyst Professor Siphamandla Zondi. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Let's look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What is at stake?
A lot is at stake. Good evening. A lot is at stake for us who are on the sidelines of the global economy, who have not benefited when the economy was growing globally, who have remained marginalized. War, conflict, contestation, geopolitical, tit for tat does not help us because it is likely to lead to increase in cost of living, increase in inflation as it's happening now, increase in the price of oil, which would mean increase in the price of food, price of, the cost of transportation and stuff like that. It is just not good for us. It is bad for us, which is why it is perhaps very important for us to argue that this war must end and that the conditions are created that it must not happen again. Through a negotiated solution that addresses all the issues so that you don't have this flare-up again after 3 or 4 years. Because we remember that there was a flare-up of this conflict in 2014. We remember that it has gone on and the situation has been intensified and it's been very tense for now about 8 years. But diplomacy failed because we did not use it to prevent the situation that has happened now. From happening by addressing all the concerns from all sides and creating no conditions for military solutions to any problem at all.
And talking about, the situation escalating, we saw yesterday that vote in the UN, of course, and the debates around it, even the representative of Russia coming out to say that he would call on members to either abstain or vote against this particular, resolution, but then saying that he understands the pressure that those that were in the House were under from the Western nations. I wonder, when you look at the votes, what do they tell us?
It tells us the West is strong. It is true. The West is very, very strong. When it believes in something, excuse me, and it wants to rally the world in that direction, it is able to run it. Imagine if the West wanted to end all wars and all harassment of people, then we would not have Iraq. You would not have Afghanistan. You would not have what is happening in Palestinian territory. The West, by the way, has a massive ability to control what we all think and to frame what we think about whatever it happens, and therefore cause us to decide in particular ways. So there is, in that the vote yesterday, a clear, overwhelming consensus that this war must end and that Russia must pull back. But whether the UN will be able to carry out the terms of that resolution is another question.
Now, Prof, still on that vote, I mean, there's now criticism that is directed at South Africa on how it, handled the issues, of course, coming from that. Let's look at the fact that yesterday it abstained, but also we saw just last week varying statements that have been coming out. I wonder, what do you make of how the country has been handling the issues?
South Africa's position traditionally, since 1994, is you should speak against war. You should speak against violence as a solution to political problems. That political problems require political solutions. And those political solutions, according to South Africa, almost predictable always. It's negotiation, it's diplomacy. And often this is generally accepted. Except in situations where there is a significant group of people who believe that that is not a solution. The mature political dialogue is not a solution, but a solution may be invasion, a solution may be sanctions, the solution is all any of those unilateral actions that are meant to punish this side or punish the other side, and all of those things. And such as in this particular case, a whole project has been made which require only one solution, and everyone has one solution. We don't have a choice. If you choose anything else, we think you are weak, or we think you are not democratic enough, or we think you are unwise. Because this one solution that has been required of all of us universally, is condemn Russia. Don't even try to understand where this thing comes. Just condemn Russia and end there. Don't condemn the other side. Don't condemn NATO for the military build-up over the past 10 years. Just condemn Russia. That's the only view allowed. If you don't take that view, the forces that be can completely weaken you. It's not a very democratic situation. You're not allowed to have a different view.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for that, and we'll continue, of course, to monitor a story as we are seeing those talks that, also, going to take place, of course, between Russia and the Ukraine. Whether or not we're going to be seeing a breakthrough is another story. That's International Analyst Professor Siphamandla Zondi.